Now, Birsa Munda again was a story which was there with me for the last 20, 30 years. Like you mentioned, I remember in the 1980s and 90s when I was growing up in Jamshedpur, there was so much curiosity about Birsa Munda because there was, invariably there would be a chalk here, a basti over there, named after. Fortunately, whenever one would try to know a little more about the character, and when I say no, I would, I mean authentic information. That authentic information was historical course correction which is happening in the country, whether it is Subhash Chandra Bose, whether it is Patel, or whether it is Birsa Munda. All of these characters who have been consciously put on the back burner or who have been consciously relegated to the back seats of history now need to come into the forefront. They need to get their due. I think he led a very evolving life. From embracing Christianity to shunning it, from emerging as a preacher, as a social reformer, a healer, and then evolving or metamorphosing into. Most of these characters were not authentically documented or reported while. Now, from 1853 onwards, apart from just the zamindars, there was a conscious effort to culturally subjugate the Adivasi population or the Vanvasi population. That was done by getting in the Vanvasis who were enticed, who were given all sorts of inducements to convert. They would be told that the primary fight of the Adivasi population was against the zamindars or against the missionaries. These two essentially represent Britishers in the far-flung areas, and so therefore by default it was against the. So cultural subjugation, which used to happen in the British Raj, unfortunately continues in this day and age. That by itself is a shame for our civilization. Birsa Munda was baptized on the eve of him joining the missionary school in Chaibas. The missionaries would not shy away from painting the Adivasi practices in a poor light. And it is believed that he spent that time in the company of Anand Pandey, a Vaishnavite guru, who taught him a lot about medicinal snobbery over history or his historical heroes continued for a very. Look at the contrast between Birsa Munda and Jaipal Munda. Jaipal Munda, I think, was born 3 years after Birsa Munda's death. And unlike Birsa Munda, who was an out-and-out revolutionary, here was a person who was one of the most erudite members of the Constituent Assembly. And if you go through his speeches are one of the most nuanced speeches of the Constituent Assembly. I would rate them at par with Bhimrao Ambedkar Sahab's.
Namaste. Welcome to Bharata First. Today we have Tuhin Sinha sir with us. Sir is an author and he has authored about 11 books, if I'm not wrong. And sir is an screenwriter. Apart from this, sir is also a politician. So welcome to Bharata First.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And today we will be discussing his latest book, which is Legend of Birsa Munda, and which is based on one of the great freedom fighters who laid down his life for the nation, but he has not got his considerable due in history, and it is on Birsa Munda. So he has tried to bring a factual account, as well as he has also tried to dramatize some accounts. So we'll be discussing the book in detail. So, sir, if you can just unveil the book for our viewers once, that what the book looked like.
So, in fact, this is the book. Yeah. Lots of saffron, lots of positive energy, golden shine, and obviously the sword. It's not the sword, but the bow and arrow of Birsa Munda enshrined on the book cover. So this is the book with a quotation from the Prime Minister, because Honorable Prime Minister has been one of the rare Prime Ministers who has invoked Birsa Munda so many times and has tried to give him the big place which Birsa Munda ji rightly deserved. But but the obtuse selectivism in our history books had denied Birsa Munda that place. So thank you, Nishant, for having me on your show. It will be a pleasure to interact with your viewers and share my experience of writing the book as well as my research on the book. So great. Let's. I look forward to the
Yeah.
discussion.
First of all, sir, congratulations, because it is a really what can we say, a very important figure who has been brought to forefront through your book. Because
Thank you so much.
I come from Jharkhand, and I have been seeing the name of Birsa Munda every, like, airport in Ranchi is named after him. A lot of stadiums are named after him. So he's kind of a known leader, but unknown also, because in whenever we try to search, I mean, from anybody from Jharkhand tries to search and get something written, something accountable written about him, we won't find anything like that. So it was really worth an effort, sir. So thank you from our side also. We Jharkhandis are really
My pleasure.
we,
My pleasure. You know, Jharkhand has been in existence for the last 21 years, but unfortunately, people, um, in metros are still largely unaware of the state. So, in fact, it was very surprising for me that when I first unveiled the book cover about 6 months back, there were a couple of friends in Mumbai who would ask me whether Birsa Munda is a mythological character or a historical character. So that shows the lack of awareness about Birsa Munda, even in this generation. And if the book serves the purpose of bringing the story of Birsa Munda to every house in the country, and if it makes the younger generation more enlightened and more informed about the greatness of Birsa Munda, it would have served its purpose. So that was precisely the reason why I felt compelled to write the book.
Yeah, sir. So I'll begin with my first question. My first question is that, having known about your works, it's not a lot on history. I mean, history is not a subject you write much about it. So this was something historical, although a lot of characters, apart from Birsa Munda's characters, have been dramatized. So how was this journey? Was this exciting? Was this tough? So how was it?
So, our generation didn't grow up wanting to become authors. We became authors and writers by default. So when I wrote my first book, That Thing Called Love, that was a relationship story. Again, very stark, very real, inspired from stuff that I was seeing around me in Mumbai. Um, that was an incidental journey into writing a book. That was not something which was pre-planned. That was not something. But once the book was out and once the book became a huge success, I had two options: either to write a sequel, then a third sequel, which many peers or many fellow writers did. But then I realized that I had bringing out my first book was it's something which not many people were able to do at that point of time in 2006. So instead of following the very conventional or the cliched path of writing similar books, and doing sequels and sub-sequels to that, I decided to raise the bar. I decided that the first 5 books of mine should be as different from each other as possible. The second one was a cricket thriller, 22 Yards, which later came out in the form of as The Captain. Again, the captain of the team was from Jamshedpur, if you have read the book. So that was my twist to what seemed like a very real story, again, obviously inspired from real events, but fictionalized. Then I wrote 3 political / socio-political books: Of Love and Politics, The Edge of Desire, The Edge of Power. So I think once I realized that I could pull off these multiple genres, I think the faith of my readers only gave me the strength to experiment that much more. And at this stage of my career, when I am equally entrenched in a political role and in a political career, my books tend to further some of the political thoughts or narratives which I have in mind. So the previous book, Mission Shenzhen, was a geopolitical thriller which against a pandemic backdrop, which was probably the first book which kind of probed the changing geopolitical world order as a result of the pandemic. And it painted China as a villain. It painted a picture of democracies, a league of democracies emerging together to take on China in the years to come. So while most of my writing still remains very true to real incidents, very true to real life, I tend to fictionalize it to make it more palatable, to make it more easily consumable for readers who who are not so entrenched into non-fiction reading. Now, Birsa Munda again was a story which was there with me for the last 20, 30 years. Like you mentioned, I remember in the 1980s and 90s when I was growing up in Jamshedpur, there was so much curiosity about Birsa Munda because there was, invariably there would be a chowk here, a basti over there named after Birsa Munda. So in Jamshedpur, in one part of Telco Colony where we were staying, there was a Birsa Nagar, a huge basti adjoining that particular area. Obviously, Ranchi has Birsa Munda Chowk, it has Birsa Munda Airport, and I'm sure almost all parts of Jharkhand have places and playgrounds named after Birsa Munda. But unfortunately, whenever one would try to know a little more about the character, and when I say no, I would, I mean authentic information, that authentic information was lacking. So thankfully, after 2014, the narrative changed somewhat. And due to the conscious effort of Prime Minister Modi to bring subaltern history to the forefront, there was a lot of inquisitiveness about these characters. And simultaneously or concurrently, I was at a stage when I was, hunting for the next big story. So I think it was a happy coincidence that Birsa Munda, drew me to himself. And again, the story had been with me for the last 2 or 3 years, but thankfully the long lockdown, the first lockdown in 2020 when COVID had just struck, that long lockdown was the time when I decided that this is the time, the 3 or 4 months that I'm getting together at a stretch without any movement, without touring or without traveling. I think this is the time when this book needs to be put together. And thankfully, my co-author did the first draft. But it's a journey which I don't think there are words to describe the journey, and I just wish that it adds to the process of the historical course correction which is happening in the country, whether it is Subhash Chandra Bose, whether it is Patel, or whether it is Birsa Munda. All of these characters who have been consciously put on the back burner or who have been consciously relegated to the back seats of history now need to come into the forefront. They need to get their due, their honor. And if I specifically talk about Birsa Munda, in a short span of 24, 25 years, I think he led a very evolving life. From embracing Christianity to shunning it, from emerging as a preacher, as a social reformer, a healer, and then evolving or metamorphosing into a political revolutionary. In a short span of 24 and a half years, his life had probably all the shades which a person living twice that age would have. And that marks the beauty of that life. Now, as far as the impact of that revolution is concerned, I can just say that in 1908, when the Chota Nagpur Land Tenancy Act was implemented or enacted, which was one of the most path-breaking reforms insofar as Adivasi land holdings was concerned. Now, 8 years after the death of Birsa Munda, if the Britishers realized the importance of that reform, I think that only shows the impact of Birsa Munda's revolution even after he had died. And in fact, that again is the beauty of subaltern history. Most of these characters were not authentically documented or reported while they were alive, because they were, the administration tended to be dismissive about them. It was only after their death that people woke up to their achievements, people woke up to their lives and started researching on them, started reaching out to people who had known them, and availing of first-hand information. And that is one of the reasons why I played it safe, and I tried to fictionalize or dramatize the secondary characters, because one, I'm not a historian. So I did feel that since this is a very important body of work, if I'm not 100% sure about the authenticity of each and every fact, I should rather play it safe and be responsible towards my readers. Secondly, like I said, there is any which way, awareness was lacking about the character of Birsa Munda. So for a lot of people spread across the country, especially for the younger readers, a slightly dramatized form makes it more easy to gulp down the book, or more easy to absorb the information.
So, sir, like you talked about subaltern movements. So, subaltern movements have played a major role when it comes to national movement. Also, but they were not given their due. But where I feel how much I have read is that wherever I have read that they have been concerned that they were not against British Raj as a whole, but they were against anyone who was against, I mean, the system, tribal system or something like that, local regional system. So how do you see that?
See, largely, the battle in tribal areas was not a direct fight against the Britishers. The Britishers had outsourced their rule, or outsourced their job to two different sources. One is the zamindars. So, while the Britishers largely concentrated themselves in cities and in urban areas, it were the zamindars who carried out the menacing atrocities, or, all the who made life difficult for the tribal population in the villages. Now, from 1853 onwards, apart from just the zamindars, there was a conscious effort to culturally subjugate the Adivasi population, or the Vanvasi population. That was done by getting in the German missionaries over here. And subsequently, from late 1850s onwards, they were given specific targets of conversions of a certain number of people every year. So largely, the Britishers had outsourced their rule in tribal areas and subaltern areas and in far-flung areas to these two offshoots, the zamindars and the missionaries. And both of these complemented each other. For example, the missionaries were dependent upon financing from the zamindars. And at the same time, the zamindars would depend upon them, because the missionaries would give their children or their kins the best of education without any attendant burdens of converting them. So in this whole thing, the only people who got trapped were the poorest of the poor. The Vanvasis, who were enticed, who were given all sorts of inducements to convert, they would be told that your pending loans would be waived off, your every amount that is due from you would be waived off. But then subsequently they would realize that eventually the missionaries were surviving on the finances of the zamindars, and so forget waiving off their loans, the atrocities sometimes would only increase. So I think in this situation, while yes, the primary fight of the Adivasi population was against the zamindars or against the missionaries, these two essentially represented Britishers in the far-flung areas, and so therefore by default it was against the Britishers. It was a more layered, a more complex fight, and
As you mentioned, conversion, sir. Conversion is again an elephant in the room, and recently one incident took place. A girl named Lavanya. She was, I guess, she was forced to convert, but when she denied that, she just had to suicide. So that is the missionary onslaught is still going on, and it is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, as you mentioned, that it had been there since 1800s, and even Birsa Munda had his family had to go through it. So how do you see this proselytization problem in India?
First of all, I think it is extremely shameful that somebody like Lavanya in this day and age, after 75 years of our independence, has to commit suicide because of predatory proselytization activity. So cultural subjugation, which used to happen in the British Raj, unfortunately continues in this day and age. That by itself is a shame for our civilization. Now, even I have studied in a missionary school. I have studied in Loyola School, Jamshedpur. And I know for a fact that there are many missionary schools in India which impart education without the unnecessary evil expectation of those imbibing education converting to their religion. But yes, there are certain groups of missionaries who have this toxic ability of forcing their religion upon, or forcing their cultural / religious supremacy upon people. And I think that needs to be curtailed with an iron hand. So ideally, we should have a nationwide law against predatory proselytization activity. Because, like I said, missionary activity which does not impinge or does not carry this extra expectation of conversion is fine. There are Hindus running the institutions, there are Muslims running institutions, but then if that institution imparts education with a hidden or overt expectation that those imbibing the education should convert, that practice eventually leads to a lot of unnecessary social tension, which is very visible in certain parts of Jharkhand, which is very visible in certain parts of Andhra Pradesh. And with this incident of Lavanya in Tamil Nadu, I'm sure this evil practice is more in existence than what is estimated. So yes, this needs to be curtailed with an iron hand. Like I said, it shames our civilization that a thing like this should continue in this day and age after 75 years after our independence.
Yes, and one more thing I would like to state is that you have mentioned one of the incident from the life of Birsa Munda, that his family also converted, but a lot of people in Jharkhand or any part of India are not aware about that. His fight was also against Christian missionaries. So please, if you can shed some light on this.
So Birsa Munda's father had converted much before Birsa Munda had to convert. Birsa Munda was baptized on the eve of him joining the missionary school in Chaibasa, where he studied between 1886 to 1890. And with a very positive mindset, he imbibed that education with a very open mind. But it was only when he eventually realized that education carried this expectation, this toxic expectation of culturally subjugating the tribals. And it was only when he realized that through a hidden motive at every given opportunity, the missionaries would not shy away from painting the Adivasi practices in a poor light, that he rebelled. So there was an incident which one is not very clear about what exactly was that incident. And that is where, like I said, I have used the device of dramatization. And again, the feedback which I have received from readers, which includes somebody very erudite like Ashish Chandorkarji. So, in my books or in my writing, I try to, most of my characters carry gray shades. So if I have shown an evil missionary or an evil priest, there is also somebody who's very balanced, who's very well-intentioned to counter that. Because we need to realize that there is no institution as such which is bad. There are people who come with evil intentions and good intentions. So I have painted both sides of the missionary mindset. Birsa Munda, at one point of time, when he realized that set of missionaries who were bent upon subjugating or bent upon painting a condescending or, those set of missionaries who had a condescending view towards the Adivasi population, when he realized that those were the ones who would be calling the shots at the Chaibasa missionary school, that is when he realized that he basically did not have a future there. He would eventually, if he did not follow their teachings blindly. And in fact, that is the beauty of Birsa Munda as a character. Throughout his school, throughout his stay in that school of 4 years, while he read up the Bible, while he read up all possible literature about the Christian religion, he wanted an open hand in deciding whether or not he would imbibe that education in totality, or whether he would continue to follow the age-old practices. And in fact, it is believed that he was very close to one of the staff, lower level staff members in that school, whom I have shown as one of the cleaner guys. And often in his conversations with that elderly person, he would devise his strategy, or he would devise his worldview in the wake of the teachings that he was imbibing. So he rebelled eventually, and he came out of it in 1890s. And in fact, when he came back to his village from being a celebrated person whom I think the entire village had pinned a lot of hopes on, because very few people in that village got an opportunity to study in that school. From that celebratory status, he was suddenly shunned. People would start looking down upon him. And then another incident followed where in abject penury and poverty, he did something which embarrassed the entire family, post which he had to leave the village. And he disappeared, and for 4 years he lived in wilderness. Nobody really knew where he was till he re-emerged in 1894 with some special powers. And it is believed that he spent that time in the company of Anand Pandey, a Vaishnavite guru, who taught him a lot about medicinal healing, because he was one of the Vaidyas, doctors in that region, who knew a lot about the abilities of plants to heal human body. And at the same time, he was somebody who was very well versed with the Gita. So he used teachings of Gita to mold Birsa Munda's worldview. By the time Birsa Munda's re-emerged in his village in 1894, people were mesmerized to see the special powers that he had. He could heal people by looking at them. He could, and obviously he, from that path onwards, he also treaded on a path of social reforms. He advised villagers not to be superstitious. He preached a life of simplicity. He mobilized them against the atrocities of the zamindars. But at the same time, there is a very clear distinction between 1894 and 1895. He never advocated, or he was never in favor of a violent revolution. In fact, he preached non-violence. It was only when in 1895 the Britishers grew increasingly insecure of his cult status. It was only when thousands and thousands of people would throng that village from far off areas, that the Britishers felt that if his popularity is not curtailed, if he's not cut to size, he could be the next Messiah who's going to lead a revolution. So his apprehension, his being apprehended or eventually punished with 2 years of prison, was largely out of apprehensions. There was no real incident to prove that he was planning a political conspiracy. But yes, by the time he came out of the jail in 1897, November, 1896-97 were also the worst years, one of the worst years in India in terms of famine, in terms of pandemic. And by the time he came out, he realized that the destruction which the Britishers and the zamindars had done was so enormous that when his supporters this time advised him for a violent revolution, he was open to it. And thereafter, in a span of 2 years, he mobilized his army of people, and he finally launched his movement or that revolution on the eve of Christmas in 1899.
Yeah, that was called Ulgulan, and it is still what can you say, a slogan which is popular in Jharkhand, but a lot of people do not know the story behind it, be it Ulgulan or be it Abua Desham, Abua Raj. So, sir, one more thing I like to state, although it is a historical kind of question, yeah, don't you think that history has not been kind to leaders like Birsa Munda, Tilka Manchi, Raghunath Mahato, or Siddho Kanu, or for that matter, a more modern leader who was one of the main members of Constituent Assembly, Jaipal Singh Munda, and Jaipal Singh Munda is, we only know that we have a stadium in his name in Ranchi, but what he achieved is incomparable. Nobody can achieve that much. He was a hockey captain. He was part of hockey, winning the gold winning hockey team. He was also ICS member,
No,
and the
absolutely.
tribal yeah,
I Yeah.
tribal rights, whatever we see in the constitution are because of him. So what do you think might have been the reason behind
When
this?
I started my research, I was very fascinated and equally intrigued by the fact that 1857 was not the first war of independence. In fact, a parallel freedom movement has existed in India from 1770s. Raghunath Bahato and Tilka Maji were the architects of this movement. And then by the early 1900s, simultaneously, this tribal movement had begun to happen in almost every part of the country. There was Rani Gadiliu in uh, Rani Gadiliu came much later. There was U. Tirot Singh in Meghalaya.
Yeah,
There were fighters in Kerala. And throughout the 19th century, whether it was Tantia Bhil in
Rajasthan.
Tantia Bhil, no, Tantia Bhil was in Madhya Pradesh.
Okay.
Tantia Bhil was in Madhya Pradesh. So there were at least 20 important revolutionaries. Uh, there were at least 20 important revolutionaries who had been launching their movement throughout. But unfortunately, they never got their due. So I think, see, there are two reasons why their work has not been documented. One, like I mentioned, throughout subaltern history was never something which academicians or even the administration took seriously. They were always dismissive about these movements during the lifetime of these heroes. So post they were gone, it becomes very difficult to accumulate primary sources of information. Secondly, even post our independence, unfortunately, history books or syllabuses was largely in the hands of left. I would not say liberals. I think left anarchist is a better word. So as a result of which, this snobbery over history or his historical heroes continued for a very long time. So, but that fortunately, finally, that course correction is happening. So, in fact, let me assure you that Birsa Munda is not the first or the last book that I'm working on. There is a series of books on subaltern history from here, which I'm working on. And I think the next would be coming on the eve of Independence Day in August. And there's another one which is coming out mid next year. So I think finally there are people who are taking up the cudgels for subaltern heroes, and there should be some remarkable historical course correction from here. The credit obviously goes to a large extent to Honorable Prime Minister Modi, because, like I said, the way Birsa Munda has been invoked by him on so many occasions, important occasions. I wish some of our earlier prime ministers had been so kind to Birsa Munda. And why Birsa Munda? If you look at Siddho Kano, the Santhal insurrection of 1855 was as impactful as the 1857 War of Independence. So I think this duality in our coverage of history makes our history extremely flavored, and it is time for us to be a little more fair to our subaltern heroes, which fortunately is happening now.
Yeah, actually, we can also thank social media for this, because now no more books are dominant for knowing the historical narrative. And after coming up of social media, the alternative narrative has also started to come, and a lot of stories which were till the age of social media, unknown to us, have started to come. So I'll not make you wait longer. So I'll take my last question, and that is, what are the major takeaways one can take from the life of Birsa Munda? Because a lot of youth who are especially preparing for UPSC civil services watch our channel. So what are the major takeaways that you'd like to suggest?
Historical heroes and important characters are about, how you interpret them. So I'm glad you also mentioned Jaipal Munda ji. So if you look at the contrast between Birsa Munda and Jaipal Munda, I think, was born 3 years after Birsa Munda's death. And unlike Birsa Munda, who was an out and out revolutionary, here was a person who was one of the most erudite members of the Constituent Assembly. And if you go through his speeches are one of the most nuanced speeches of the Constituent Assembly. I would rate them at par with Bhimrao Ambedkar Sahab's speeches. It is quite possible, again, that while Jaipal Munda served the Adivasi or the Vanvasi population in a completely different avatar, he drew his inspiration from Birsa Munda. In fact, I have gone to the extent of saying, and I say this because it is purely my inference, it is purely my initial inference, I would say. History about subaltern heroes in those days, that is pre-independence days, was largely, about hearsay. Because there were any which way, even now there is limited source of information. In those days, pre-independence days, there was even lesser information. So it is quite possible that even Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose might have drawn some inspiration from Birsa Munda, because he came from a region which is barely 300 kilometers away from Birsa Munda's stronghold, from Birsa Munda's area of Andolan. It is quite possible that the tales of heroic revolution of Birsa Munda may have inspired him to creating the private army, because on a much smaller scale, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose did it on an international scale, but on a much smaller scale, Birsa Munda did it traveling from village to village, forest to forest, and in a situation where the sources of communication and commutation were 1/10 of what Subhash Chandra Bose had. So yes, I mean, how a historical character inspires the present or the future generations, I think, is purely a matter of interpretation. Birsa Munda might inspire somebody to usher in a digital revolution today in his village. I think it is more about Birsa Munda as a thought. Birsa Munda is an emotion. Birsa Munda is a sentiment. It is about an underdog or a dark horse challenging the entire system and ushering in a revolution, which, most people would have been extremely dismissive of. So that revolution in today's day and age could be a digital revolution in a village. The next big digital entrepreneur could come from one of the most backward tribal village in the country. He would be the right tribute to Birsa Munda today.
Thank you, sir. It was great interacting to you. It was really enriching, and knowing our great icon, Birsa Munda, from you. And thank you for giving us time. And I request my viewers to please buy the book and read, because Birsa Munda is a character that needs to be read about. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I hope, like I said, the whole idea of writing the book was that Birsa Munda's story reaches every house in the country. And every child grows up reading about his bravery. And I hope, it serves that purpose, if not fully, then at least partially. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.